Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? I'm Nat.
I'm Jack.
And today I have no idea what Jack is going to be presenting on, so why don't you let us know?
It is on the Malaysia and Singapore unification and split. And this is important to me because I have family in both Malaysia and Singapore. So it was really interesting to hear. But before we get started, we do need to give a shout out to our newest patrons, Alex and John. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it. And for our listeners who are not familiar with Patreon, that's a way you can support us. You can become a patron. Or if you don't like commitment, you can also just buy a sticker from us to support How Did We Not Know That? The link will be in the description. We also appreciate ratings and just telling your friends about us.
Yeah, any little bit helps. And yeah, thank you to our Patreons. We have some exciting things coming in the future, so your support will definitely help us with that. Jack, okay, so before you go, I'm so excited for this episode because I know, you talked about doing this a while back before we kind of,
over a month ago.
Yeah, but I'm so excited for this. I hope we get to hear about, your family background, too.
Oh, probably not. Maybe I'll give you a little tidbits about stories I've heard from my family, but... For anyone who's new here, we like to start each episode with a question that we will answer at the end of the episode. So the question for this episode, actually there's two questions. What is the official language of Singapore and what is the national language of Singapore? And also, whatever you say, I actually don't remember what it was, so I need to... We'll get there when we see the notes. We took a long break, everyone.
That's true, and we'll figure it out together. Okay, my guess is either... Well, you said... official and national, so I'm thinking official is that there's no official language. I think it's a trick question, but then national is English.
Okay.
I don't know. That's my...
Your guess is as good as mine. I guess not know.
We'll find out. Who knows? Who knows? Not us.
Also, sorry if we're a little rusty on this episode. There's no way we're going to be as rusty as we were in season 1, though. I heard the replay and... yikes, we improved a lot.
Yeah. It was fun, though, to listen to. I don't know. If you guys haven't listened to our replay episode, it's Jack's episode on the space race. I'm like, wow, so young, so naive.
Seriously. Okay, so let's get into the episode. So we're going to start at the end of World War II. If you look at a map of modern-day Malaysia, you will see that there are actually two parts to Malaysia. A West Malaysia, commonly known as the Malay Peninsula, and an East Malaysia, which is located on the island of Borneo. And Borneo is shared with Indonesia. And Brunei as well. So this is an episode where you might want to look at a map for it because we are going to be talking about a few different territories. And starting at the 20th century, before Malaysia even existed, there were multiple territories in that area that had been under British rule. They were either a protectorate or a colony. The 5 main territories in this region that were under English rule were Malaya and Singapore on the western peninsula, and Sarawak, North Borneo, and Brunei, they're on the Borneo Island. And so during World War II, the Japanese actually occupied these areas until 1945. Then, after World War II, the territories are returned to the British, but this is also the time where the British Empire is broke and they don't have enough money to hold their colonies. So they start their decolonization efforts and they want to make sure that they leave these territories in the hands of local leaders they can trust. Because at the end of World War II, we enter the Cold War period. So there is a genuine fear that these territories could be overtaken by communists, which the British want to avoid as much as possible. It's important to note that even though today we call the whole area Malaysia, even to the scale of a town, a village, a city in Malaysia, at this time wasn't unified. They were all different areas with different groups and different cultures and backgrounds. So in 1946, an event happens known as the Malayan Union, which was a union of the Malay states done by the British in preparation to grant the area independence. The Malayan Union actually united the areas on the Western Peninsula. Mm-hmm. So each part wasn't actually unified. They were just a bunch of tiny territories all owned by the British. So the Malaya Union was their attempt to unify all those tinier territories into one larger territory that would be ruled under one local leader that they trusted. And so Singapore, if you're not looking at a map, is a very tiny island on the south of the Western Peninsula. So when discussions happened on unifying the various Malay states in that region, most people expected that Singapore would be included in that because of the geographical location and just its relation to that area. However, Singapore is actually left out of the Malayan Union arrangement because of its economic and strategic importance as a free port and naval base for the English. In addition to that, though, and this is where it kind of gets interesting, and I have a little bit to add with my family background, they also felt that, the English also felt that because of the imbalance of ethnicities between Malaya states and Singapore, that this would complicate the acceptance of a Malay union between the area. Mm. So a quick lesson is that the racial makeup of Malaya at this time versus Singapore is majority of Malaya is Malay, indigenous Malay people, and Singapore is actually majority Chinese. And so my family is Chinese Malaysian. So actually my family was in Malaya region during this time as well, but they were and still are the minority in that region. And Singapore would have been where more Chinese immigrants to that area would have settled down. And my family's been there for like way back into my great-great-grandparents like level, you know, so but, you know, they're still the ethnic minority. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
History hits different when you know people who went through it.
Yeah. Was your family, like, close? Like, were they in the southern part of Malaya? Like, were they close to Singapore? Like, do you know how and why?
Why they immigrated?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So my family is from Ipoh, Malaysia, and that is in, I guess that's closer south. It's not as south as Kuala Lumpur, but it's more south than Penang. Penang is in the northern region. And they migrated because they were poor. I mean, there's no, China was not great. They didn't enjoy that.
Yeah. It's like a big motivator for like most migrants, so
I'll get into it later, but actually I'm very proud to do this episode and learn more about it, actually, because it's known that in Malaysia the Chinese are the ones who run the businesses while the Malay are the ones who run the government. That's just the way it's always been. A lot of the businesses are run by the Chinese, and my family owned a lot of businesses, actually. They had a dim sum restaurant, they had a brick making company, they had, I think, like a rubber making company. So I'm so proud to hear about, you know, kind of how they helped build up Malaysia.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. So anyways, back to the episode. The Malaya Union plan, though. It angers a lot of Singaporeans to be left out because naturally they felt that Singapore should be a part of Malaya. And Malayans are also unhappy with the plan, but for different reasons. Mainland Malayans were not happy with the way it was set up because they felt it would give Malayan citizenship status to immigrants too easily and grant immigrant communities constitutional and political equality. And unfortunately, that seems like, okay, wait, what's going on there? And we'll see that race is a big part in the conflicts between these regions. So the Malayan Union was then replaced with the Federation of Malayan scheme on February 1st, 1948, which increased safeguards for indigenous Malays by recognizing their special position in Malaya and the sovereignty of the Malay rulers while imposing more restrictive citizenship requirements on immigrant communities. Singapore is again excluded from this. However, the British felt that this would be a temporary arrangement and that Singapore could enter the Federation in a, quote, wider union at a later date, unquote.
Oh.
So now we'll go into a quick background on Malaya and Singapore's bond between each other and the ethnic makeup. Singapore is a very small island on the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, and they mostly view themselves as one area with Malaya. Malaya was majority ethnic Malays with a minority ethnic Chinese and Indian community, and Singapore is majority Chinese with a minority Malay and Indian community. Now, have you been to Singapore? I feel like...
No, I want to go so bad. Like, that's the next place that I would want to visit. I could honestly, like, I would love to live in Singapore, too. I know I haven't been there yet, but I already know. It looks beautiful, and also just, like, the mix of, like, cultures and food. Like, you just have food from so many different places there. And then it's just so easy to travel to, like, a bunch of other Southeast Asian countries, so...
For sure. Yeah, and it's really tiny.
Know.
You can bicycle around the whole, maybe not the whole, I think, you might be able to bicycle around the whole country because it's so tiny.
I kind of love that, though. And then, like, you don't have to worry about, like public transportation. It's probably just so easy. I want to go to Singapore and not drive and
Let's
eat food.
go. I want to go, too. As soon as borders open up, we should go. I miss it a lot. But okay. Yeah, so... Well, apart from our gushing about how nice Singapore is. Yeah, Singapore is a beautiful, wealthy, bustling country in Southeast Asia, but during this time, Singapore is actually a swamp with very little infrastructure and no natural resources at all. This is why joining Malaya is very vital to the economic stability and success of the country. And without joining Malaya, it was very unlikely that Singapore would be given independence because there's no way for them to sustain themselves. They don't have natural resources. So, after being excluded from the Malayan Union and the Federation of Malaya, a merger plan between Singapore and Malaya became imperative to Singaporeans. Many Singaporean legislators felt that the division between Malaya and Singapore was artificial, and the destinies of the two territories were intertwined due to their interdependent economies. Singapore to Malaya is like New York to the USA or London to the UK, and at this time Singapore is, the cultural and the economic center. However, the path towards merging with Malaya was going to be difficult, not only because of the British hold on the territory, but because the Malayan government in Kuala Lumpur had reservations about specifically the ethnic makeup of Singapore, but also because there were threats of communist forces by far-left political forces in Singapore as well. So then we fast forward a little bit and we get to the day where Malaya is granted independence without Singapore. Malaya is officially a territory, and they are granted independence on the 31st of August, 1957, with Tunku Abdul Rahman, who was formerly the leader of the United Malay National Organization, being elected as Prime Minister. And so in 1959, Lee Kuan Yew, who is the leader of the People's Action Party, which is a political party in Singapore, ends up winning elections and becoming the first Prime Minister of Singapore. So to Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore being excluded from the Federation of Malaya was a freak man-made frontier caused by poor judgment from the British, who had ignored the history of the peoples of Malaya. Lee and many other people in Singapore saw themselves as one with Malaya. And again, he also saw the merger as integral to Singapore's economic survival. They have no natural resources without Malaya, and without any resources, they would be unable to create jobs or generate growth. So without achieving the economic stability then, there was going to be little to no chance that the British would agree to grant Singapore statehood. Thus, the merger was the main goal of the PAP, People's Action Party, and what Lee Kuan Yew campaigned on. So now we'll get into specifics about the reservations against Singapore joining Malaya. In order to get the merger, the PAP government had to convince the Malayan government of the benefits of the union. Again, Malaya is currently run by Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman, and Tunku had shown little to no interest in addressing the prospect of Singapore joining the Federation. This was mainly because Singapore had a large Chinese population, and if Singapore were to join the Federation, it would make the Chinese the largest ethnic group, with Chinese at 3.6 million and Malays at 3.4 million. So he viewed a Chinese majority electorate as a threat to UMNO's political dominance in Malay politics. However, there was also a potentially larger political risk of Singapore achieving independence outside of the Federation, which was the threat of communist forces. And these forces had been on the rise in Singapore, especially the longer it took for Singapore to become independent, the greater this threat of communism became.
I know. I don't know. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding like Malaya's point of view as why they don't want to merge with Singapore, because like, okay, yeah, there's the racial element and they're scared of like losing their power in the government, gaining like the Chinese minority gain more presence and like power in Malaya. But also like Singapore is such, obviously like you've talked about in this episode, it has such important strategic location, and like it's such a valuable it's just such a valuable location. So it's like, would you want that as your competing neighbor? Like if you're not gonna like merge with them, then you're just competing, like then you're just neighbors. And I don't know, I feel like they'd be a better addition rather than like just another like a competition. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think that, well, because it's still a swamp, they probably don't feel threatened
That's true.
by competition.
They don't realize what it's going to become.
Yeah, but also, too, for us today, it's easy to think, oh, why wouldn't you just merge it? But I guess racial tensions were probably a lot higher back then. And even today, I don't want to say anything that offends anyone, so I apologize. This is just my experiences with my own family in Malaysia. But I do know that it's not super beneficial to be Malaysian if you're not Malay, because you do not get as many rights, you do not get as much funding, you are treated as a second-class citizen. And so yeah, if they did take in Singapore, then the Chinese do have enough to vote Malays out of government. They do have enough political power to change the country, and especially at this time when they had gone for so long without getting independence from the British, that's probably the last thing they wanted to do, was potentially set it up that they would be ruled by another group that they felt wasn't in sync with them.
That's true. Yeah, it's super complicated.
So, okay, there's a lot of good reasons now to probably take Singapore in, like we just said, because of the threat of communism. On the 27th of May in 1961, at a meeting of foreign correspondents held in Singapore, the Tunku, and side note, Tunku is a Malay royal title, it's like similar to Prince, he made the announcement that he wanted to create a, quote, mighty Malaysia, unquote, that would include Singapore. So the reason for this decision was because there would be a change in the details of the merger. Instead of just a merger between Malaya and Singapore, they would also add the British Borneo territories that were also not yet independent, Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo. These are the three territories I mentioned at the beginning that are on the east side of Malaysia, on the island of Borneo. The reason they're doing this, it's kind of icky, but it feels a little icky. They're doing this because this would then prevent the Chinese from becoming a majority by adding 700,000 indigenous people and 176,000 Malays from the Borneo territories. So the 3.7 million Chinese would be outnumbered by the 4 million Malays and indigenous people.
How do those territories feel about like joining Malaya?
We will get into it, because I think it's kind of funny, and I watched a really good documentary. I'll try to link that in the description if anyone's interested, because it's this is pretty recent history, so a lot of the people who are part of this are still alive, so they talk about what that was like, hearing the news and joining. Anyways, also, Tunku would allow for Singapore to join as an autonomous state with absolute rights to determine its internal affairs, except in the matters of defense, external affairs, and internal security, and it could also retain a very large portion of its state revenue, because Singapore does make a lot of money because they are a very well-located island. And in return, Singapore would have to accept a disproportionately smaller representation of 15 seats in government instead of 24 seats, which they should have had based on their population size. In addition, Singapore citizens would only be able to vote in Singapore and would be referred to as nationals instead of citizens of the new Federation of Malaysia.
Yikes.
Yeah. Lee Kuan Yew, who is the Prime Minister of Singapore, immediately issued a response to Tunku's announcement in June 1961 to affirm his support for Tunku. So in August of 1961, Lee and Tunku issued a joint statement announcing that they had agreed to the merger terms between Singapore and Malaya, and this was then published in a white paper on November 16th, 1961. Now, the next few years are spent convincing leaders of Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo to join the merger and become Malaysia. So now this is like, okay, we're really trying to form Malaysia. This is when Malaysia's like, we're working on it. So Lee, Tunku, and the British spend a lot of time together working on this, but it wasn't as easy as Tunku and the British had hoped because they erroneously, or very wrongly, considered Sarawak, Brunei, and Borneo as extensions of Malaysia, and that the groups of people in those areas were more similar to them than the Chinese that were already in Malaya.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like...
It's sad to hear because it's like these Chinese people have been in Malaysia for multiple generations and they're still not considered.
Yeah, like despite the fact that they've been living there for centuries, like they're considered less compared to like people, these territories who have like have been living independently.
Yeah, the biggest difference between them actually was in regards to religion. So in Malaya, Islam is their official religion, but a lot of the different tribes and groups of people were actually concerned that they'd be forced to practice Islam if they joined. So another criticism against merger was that it seemed like a form of neo-colonialism where these territories would just now be under a new ruler who had been approved of by the British. A lot of this came from left-wing parties that people deemed communist.
Ooh.
Another political party emerges to protest against the merger on the basis of the unequal government representation and the rights of Singaporeans to become full citizens, as they felt they would be seen as second-class citizens. You're not wrong.
Yeah.
In response to these criticisms, Lee, Prime Minister of Singapore, goes on air to deliver a series of radio talks between September and October of 1961 to clarify and explain the political situation between Singapore and the Federation. Lee explained that the 15-seat allocation in government was a maximum that was allowed for all the territories, and that other than voting rights, Singaporeans would receive the same rights and privileges of all citizens of Malaysia. However, Lee then went to renegotiate terms of the merger with Tunku to accept all Singaporean citizens as Malaysian citizens, but only in name, as Singaporeans would still only be able to vote in Singapore.
Man, oh my god, this stresses me out. Just
I know, right? But I have a lot more respect for the fam history now.
The fam.
Yeah, my fam. Like, they wouldn't understand what it's like being a minority. It's like, wanna bet? Like, they probably know more.
Yeah.
So, anyways, to gather popular support over the merger terms, Lee actually decided to submit the question of the merger to a referendum known as the National Referendum of 1962, which allowed the electorate to vote on 3 different options to decide on Singapore's unification with Malaya. However, each of the 3 options just said yes with a different wording, so there was no way to say that you were against the merger.
What?
Yeah, and if you're curious, the options were A, proceed with the merger on terms laid out in the white paper, B, complete an unconditional merger as a state on an equal basis with the other 11 states, or C, complete the merger on terms no less favorable than the terms for the Borneo territory. So it's, just no way to say no.
Yeah, so either way, you're like, we're gonna merge, but like, how?
Yeah. And so obviously, like, A is the best choice. Like, just go with what we're given.
Yeah.
So obviously, a lot of the opposition felt that the referendum was a sham and did not reflect the will of the people. But at this point, it was clear that the PAP was going to finalize Singapore's merger with Malaya. So finally, on the 9th of July 1963, Singapore's merger with Malaya is finalized when Britain, the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak ratified the Malaysian Agreement, which spelled out the terms for the formation of the Federation of Malaysia. If you were listening carefully, you may notice that Brunei was originally supposed to be in this, but they ended up not being a part of the unification as they decided to opt out of the agreement because they didn't want to give their oil reserves to Malaya.
Oh.
And there was a lot of public opposition to the merger. Most importantly, the Sultan of Brunei would not be as powerful if he was no longer the sole monarch, so they decided to stay under the British until 1984.
Wow. 1984?
Quite a bit of time. I guess it was only
That's a long
about
time,
like 20
though.
years later. A little over, 20 years. Well, I mean, the Sultan's probably still alive. So it was worth it. With the signing of the Malaysia Agreement, the date for the formation was set for August 31st, 1963. Side note, though, it was actually delayed to 16th of September 1963 because the United Nations had decided to run a study to ensure that the people in the Borneo territories were in favor of the merger. And this study was commissioned as a final attempt actually by Indonesia and the Philippines to prevent the formation of Malaysia, as they felt they had territorial claims to those areas.
Yeah.
Oh, you know about this?
Well, no, I was just like curious because Indonesia also has a part of Borneo. So I was just thinking like, so if like Southeast Asia is super interesting because it's basically just like so many islands, and so like the territories that each country claims isn't necessarily, like when you look at a map, it doesn't look very natural. Like it's a bunch of clumpings of islands, right? So I was like thinking while you're talking about this, I'm like, I wonder what Indonesia's doing and like the Philippines are doing, because like they see Malaya like forming and like gaining new territory. Are they kind of like, because Malaysia, like modern day Malaysia and Indonesia are like right next to each other, so it's like I
Yeah.
wonder if they're like trying to do anything to like